The Rosetta Wall, written and read by Elton Gar. Professor Jerimoth stood at the edge of the freeway and looked at the graffiti-covered wall. He had walked past it every day for months, enjoying the constant change of colors, names, and phrases. He hoped someday walls like this one might be preserved, just as he helped preserve sites of ancient art around the world, including sites that had graffiti from Rome and before. Sites that helped them understand the past the same way that this wall might help someone 1,000 years from now understand his time. Trying to think like those men, Professor Jerimoth looked more carefully at the wall. There were plenty of English words, but not everything was English. Many of them were names or slang that he didn't understand. There was also Spanish, French, and some Cantonese. The last he didn't understand well. But he also saw a few words in Latin, a nickname of one of the smarter taggers he had assumed. As a dead language, Latin was in some ways easier to learn than the constantly shifting and twisting words of a living language. And almost anyone could recognize Latin, even if they didn't know what it meant. But it wasn't just Latin. Now that he was focused on the wall, he saw some tags that he had dismissed as random symbols were stylized hieroglyphics that were similar to the hieroglyphics on the Rosetta Stone. That wasn't impossible to learn now that they had been able to decipher it, but it wasn't that common either. And now that he was focused, he saw several words in Mayan and a couple more in classic Sumerian. The only good explanation was that one of his grad students had seen him walk by and was playing a joke on the professor, convincing him that people were tagging the city in dead languages. It wasn't the smartest prank. They were breaking the law, even if most people didn't really care about graffiti. But if they were caught, it could get them expelled. Still, Professor Jerimoth appreciated the effort and the skill, and if he could help protect the student, he would. But for now, he took several pictures with his phone so he could decipher them later. While taking the photos, one of his students walked by, spotting his professor examining the wall. Eric was far too serious, the type of student that made even a stodgy old language professor look relaxed. He was wearing a suit to his college classes and carrying a briefcase, something he had done every day for the last 5 years they had known each other. He was also brilliant, and this was a good test for the young man. But with so few suspects, he couldn't rule out Eric entirely. So the professor beckoned Eric over and pointed at a section that seemed familiar. It was a series of straight lines that included a few plant-like symbols and one that might have been a person. You know what that is? It appears to be similar to the Banpo pottery designs, Eric said, and his eyes continued to scan the wall. He pointed at another section that the professor had already dismissed and said, "I suspect that is Olmec, though only a few of the symbols matched a Kazkahal block." The professor actually took a step back at that. This was way too much effort for a practical joke. But why else would someone paint words from a dozen different ancient languages on a wall? Some of them, like the ones from Olmec, weren't even understood by the best scholars. The only other idea he could come up with was that it was being used for what it had always been used for, to share a message. But if it was a message, it was a strange choice. There were less than a dozen people in the world who could read their message. On the other hand, they had put it somewhere that one of those dozen people walked by every day. Continuing to take pictures, the professor said, "Do you see a pattern in the symbols or the message?" "I think someone is trying to explain technical details in a language that doesn't have the correct vocabulary," Eric said, confirming the professor's hypothesis. What technical detail could they possibly be trying to explain in hieroglyphs? "Perhaps everything," Eric answered. Eric was one of the smartest people that Professor Jerimoth had ever met, and what was most impressive was his leaps of logic. It could be infuriating to see the young man learn things in days that had taken Jerimoth months or even years, but he was going to change the understanding of the world, and today Jerimoth was glad for his students' gifts. "What do you mean?" the professor asked. "A few years ago, a couple of computer science friends of mine got talking about simulations. It wasn't all that interesting until they started talking about creating a simulation of our world. Wouldn't that be impossible, or at least require so much memory as to make it pointless? After all, you'd need to store the location of every atom, and that would require atoms to do it," the professor said. He wasn't young enough to be good at computers, but he understood the basic ideas. Evidently not. I won't claim to fully understand their answer, but I know they mention fractals and algorithms and how you could simulate large amounts of the universe with simple math. If computers continue to advance, you could probably run the programs that create a virtual version of our universe on a desktop computer, Eric said. I'm not sure I understand what that has to do with this wall. Well, that's the next step. The people in the universe wouldn't know it was a simulation. To them, it would just be the universe. And if it was that easy to run, they wouldn't do just one. You'd want to collect data, and that would mean running thousands or perhaps millions of simulations. And if it was a good enough representation of the world, then the people in those programs could run their own simulations, and the people in those simulations would do the same. So you'd have a nearly infinite number of simulations inside simulations, while there would be only one real world, the professor said. He'd taken philosophy courses, but it had been long enough ago that no one had been talking about computers. That's how I understand it. And what does that have to do with ancient languages? The professor asked. Have you ever played a video game that simulates history? Let's assume I'm too old for video games, the professor said. I played them when I was a kid. They're one of the reasons I got interested in ancient languages. Every game is different, but they have a few things in common. One is so obvious you barely think about it. They never run in real time. They run hundreds or thousands of times faster. You can't play a game or get data from a simulation if it moves at the same speed that you do. You'd want to run those simulations from start to end in a few weeks. And if the people in the simulation created their own languages, you wouldn't have time to learn it, the professor said. But you'd likely know the earlier, simpler languages, the type you might have programmed into the simulation, Eric answered. But you'd have to find someone who understood them. And why would they send a message? And what would it be? Jerimoth said. I'd be glad to help you figure that out, Eric answered, adjusting his tie. The professor had one of his other students take over his classes for the next few days, while the two of them studied what he expected might be the greatest discovery in history. Not just in his field. This is practically the equivalent of finding proof of God. Over the next few days, the two spent almost all of their time studying the wall. At first, it seemed largely random. Much of it matched what Eric had suggested, but none of the languages had the words necessary to express that idea, making the message vague and difficult to pin down until the professor found the key to the message. It read, "We need to speak. Please tell us which of these languages you best understand, and we will use that to communicate." It was a simple answer. The Latin they used was archaic and difficult to read, but he knew it well enough they didn't have to look up every word. So he sent Eric to get a can of spray paint and wrote the answer in Latin. A few minutes later, the entire wall seemed to shift, changing from the graffiti to what could be best described as a textbook spray painted on a wall in Latin. There were even a few pictures and graphs. "What is that?" Eric asked. "It's a questionnaire. They seemed interested in our understanding of basic science," the professor said. "In Latin," Eric responded. "Yes, and not the Latin that scientists tend to use. That's really more of a modern construct. For now, they just want to know if we understand basic concepts. The last one is about gravity. This one is about photosynthesis," the professor said, as he spray painted a simple answer on the wall, which once again shifted. They had someone's attention. Then Eric grabbed the professor by the arm and said, "Does that say what I think it says?" "It says the mind of the tool grows too small to hold you," the professor said. "Could that mean computer memory?" Eric asked. "If you touch any word, it will change to other languages," the professor said. Eric tapped twice and was replaced by another word that roughly meant memory as well. That suggested they were in trouble. The professor wasn't an expert on computers. He preferred books, but he had a fairly good idea what would happen when a computer ran out of memory, and it wasn't good. But he had to focus on the task at hand. He was a linguist. Someone else could deal with the ramifications of his discoveries. But Professor Jerimoth's curiosity overwhelmed him. If the creators of the simulation went to all the effort of contacting them, there must be a solution. So the professor went to the empty part of the wall and wrote, "Please tell us what your solution is." There was a moment, and then the wall seemed to go almost blank, and, as if someone were typing on a typewriter, the words appeared on the wall one letter at a time. It read, "We have reduced memory usage. We have removed all excess data outside of the solar system and are allocating memory from all failed experiments. But you expand too quickly. We must reduce the number of complex intellectual systems by at least 50%, or complete failure is inevitable. The professor read that twice and then wrote, "Please define complex intellectual systems." The entire wall cleared of anything for a moment, and then the words appeared, slower this time. "This simulation will fail if the total number of human simulations is not reduced by half. We will adjust the simulation, but would prefer someone who understands the situation to choose the criteria of population erasure." As the professor looked at those words, he felt lightheaded and understood. They were going to erase half the people in the world, and for a moment he considered it. He wondered which people he might remove. If he could remove entire groups, who would they be? The thoughts were disgusting, and someone would have to make those decisions. Someone would have to reshape the world in their image, and it would happen because there was no other choice. But Professor Jerimoth wouldn't have to see any of that, because he made a simpler decision. If he had to choose who would die, he would make the only moral decision. He glanced at the cars in the freeway speeding past, barely glancing at the wall of graffiti that was warning of the death of half the world. He then stepped out into the traffic. This is a story I wrote a few years ago, but it felt like it fit well enough into this month's theme of mentors, teachers, and learning to be used, and gave me a chance to try to get a few stories ahead on my weekly schedule. So, if it feels different than the other stories, that could be why. It touches on an idea that I find interesting: simulation theory. At its heart, the idea is that if simulated universes can exist, then the likelihood that we're in one is very high, almost infinitely high, since there would be one reality that wasn't a simulation and an unlimited number that were. This can sound a bit like the Matrix, but that's not exactly right. The idea of the Matrix is that people are put into a simulation. That's not the case with this type of simulation. The people in the simulation, including us, would have always been in it. And it's entirely possible that none of the cultural ideas or even biological characteristics of the creators exist. It really depends on where you start the simulation. Set the beginning 100,000 years ago and you'll have biological humans. Set it a few million years before that and you'll probably have intelligent apes of some type. Go back to the Jurassic era and who knows. And if you go back to the primordial Earth, evolution could end up almost anywhere. It makes for good science fiction, but I'm not sure if it's any real value out of philosophy. Perhaps, if a scientist could figure out the algorithms that define reality, they could understand it better. And perhaps an advanced enough civilization could use that knowledge to change the laws of the simulation. But that's not us. For us, it's really just a way to force us to look at the universe in a different way and question our assumptions. And perhaps to point us in the direction for the use of technology. But mostly, it's good science fiction. If you enjoyed this story, I'll be writing more stories about mentors, teachers, and learnings for the entire month of August. You can get access to those and my thoughts by subscribing to this channel or by signing up for my free newsletter at sci-fi.com. Or you can vote on the next month's theme by becoming a free patron member at patreon.com/Elton. And if you want to help me write more of these, you can also get access to over 40 patron-exclusive short stories by signing up at any patron level. Thank you, Elton Gar.